Hello, Endeavor here. So, I had been working on a Substack essay which I was later planning on uploading to YouTube, but then my computer crashed. So now I'm using my backup computer, and unfortunately I can't access that file until the computer is fixed. So we're going to have to save that one for next month. So instead, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a more impromptu style video about Canada and the state of things in the country, because a lot has been going on over the last few months, and a lot is going to be going on this year. So I wanted to do kind of a rundown of the state of the country. A couple of months ago, Justin Trudeau announced that he's going to resign as the leader of the Liberal Party, and he's going to be replaced. So first, what I want to do is I want to talk about the Trudeau era and really what it meant for Canada and where it has left us. I'm also going to talk about the end of the Trudeau era and what will come next, as Trudeau will now be out of office, the Liberal Party will select a new leader, and this will be their candidate for this year's upcoming election. So during the 1960s is when Canada made the transition from an explicitly European-derived society comprised of the descendants of settlers from France and the British Isles to a liberal propositional nation. And this is the era which I grew up in, and then I grew up in the 1990s and 2000s. This is the liberal era of Canada. This was when Canadian identity was defined by things like Tim Hortons, hockey, maple syrup, socialized healthcare, and being more liberal than the United States, because Canada is extremely similar to the United States, so part of Canadian identity was distinguishing ourselves from the United States, which in this era, it was being more liberal than them, even though in the previous era, it was actually Canada was more conservative than the US. Since the US had separated from the British Empire and the Crown during their revolution, and Canada had remained loyal and was built by loyalists. So over the past decade, what we've seen is the liberal era of Canada, that being from the 1960s to the 2010s. We've seen that kind of coming to an end, and the beginning of the post-national Canadian era, if we want to consider these to be different eras. So what we've seen is that Canada has gone all in on Globo Homo under Justin Trudeau. So even the shallow, plastic, inauthentic identity of the liberal proposition nation of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, that was deconstructed under Trudeau. Canada embraced mass immigration, multiculturalism, a post-national identity, the LGBT agenda, feminism, the sustainable development agenda, free trade, international governing bodies, as to great an extent as almost any country in the world. Of course, this predates Trudeau, but it really was kicked into hyperdrive during the Trudeau era. This is when Trudeau declared Canada the post-national country without any single definable national identity. Some have described Canada as the model Davos country. It's the country which most accords with the worldview of the elites who congregate at Davos each year. Canada has had some of the highest rates of immigration in the world over the past 30 years, but these numbers, which were already high, rose exponentially in 2021. Vancouver and Toronto are already majority non-white cities, and almost every other major city in Canada is only about half and half at this point. They're going to be majority non-white very shortly. Most major cities in Canada now resemble China and India more than they do Canada. The price of real estate is out of control. Ordinary homes in Canada are selling for prices similar to literal European castles. There's this great YouTube channel which compares an ordinary home in Canada, which sells usually for like 2 million Canadian dollars, and it shows you this castle in Italy, which is slightly less expensive. I mean, that's how bad the situation really has gotten in terms of real estate. But it's also cost of living in general. There's this huge cost of living crisis in Canada right now. Food prices have also risen significantly, further exasperating the cost of living crisis. The job market is being flooded with cheap labor, making it difficult to find sufficient employment to be able to even afford the cost of living. The government is still trying to push through these sustainable development policies, which just add regulations and taxes onto everything, such as the reviled carbon tax. What this basically does is just a tax on everything. So, for example, it's a tax on heating your home. Now, in Canada, in the winter, when it's minus 30, Do you think anybody's not going to pay for heating because they want to save the environment? No, all it's going to do is they're going to have to pay more for the heating. And then, of course, the Canadian government's probably just going to waste that money on refugees or something like that. So this whole fighting climate change agenda, all it really ends up doing is just adding all these regulations and taxes, which just make every aspect of life more complicated and more expensive. The government, media, and education system have embarked on this national demoralization campaign over the past 10 years designed to inculcate debilitating levels of white guilt over the most desperate of attempts at creating this national original sin myth. So from 2021 onwards, we've had this mass graves hoax where they're trying to now convince you that nuns at these residential schools were massacring these indigenous kids via firing squad or something and dumping their bodies into these mass graves. Of course, absolutely zero evidence has actually been presented that anything of the sort has ever taken place, yet they're still pushing this narrative regardless. The LGBT agenda was turned up to 11 under Trudeau, with schools hosting transgender story hour, and the government threatening to remove kids from parents if they claim to be transgender, but the parents don't accommodate this. The government is booking out entire hotels in places like Niagara, some of the most expensive hotels in the entire country, to house these so-called refugees who they've just dumped onto the country, providing them with free food and shelter for months on end, all at the expense of taxpayers. So while you're paying this carbon tax to heat your home, while the money's going into housing Muhammad from Afghanistan who just walked across the border or something like that. And of course, this is going on while there's a major housing crisis. When people can't afford rent, the government will still pay for these invaders to just stay in hotels for months on end for free, some of the nicest hotels in the country. Canada has another major problem, that's with foreign infiltration. So both China and India, while demographically swamping Canada, they're now using their demographic foothold to influence the politics and economy of the country. So the NDP, the third largest party in Canada, is literally led by an Indian who supports radical Sikh nationalism and violent separatism back in India, while supporting open borders egalitarian leftism in Canada. The former defense minister, who was part of the Liberal Party, so not even the same party as Jasmeet Singh, the NDP leader, who's this radical Sikh nationalist. So this guy who was part of the Liberal Party, who was the Minister of Defense, he compromised an operation in Afghanistan to assist Canadians during the fall of Kabul in 2021. What he did was he redirected resources which had been assigned to helping Canadians who were stuck in Kabul, whether they were actual Canadians or just Afghans with Canadian passports, I don't know. But nonetheless, he redirected these resources into assisting Afghan Sikhs instead of Canadian citizens. Now, gee, why would the Sikh defense minister prioritized Sikhs in Afghanistan over Canadian citizens? A real head scratcher there. So Sikh separatist activity in Canada has gotten so bad that the Indian government is literally sending assassins to Canada in order to take these separatists out. So Canada is literally just being used as a vehicle by these radicals from India to advance their own ethno-religious national cause back in India. It's now common for there to be these street fights between Hindus and Sikhs from India in Canada. Cities like Brampton, we've seen that. They end up getting into these fights with each other in the streets. And then there's the influence from the Hindus as well, who they're also lobbying for their own ethnic interests and the national interest of India in Canada. Then there's the issue of Chinese infiltration. The Chinese government regularly interferes in Canadian politics. Wealthy Chinese people own massive portions of the real estate markets in cities like Vancouver or Toronto. The Chinese government is constantly trying to use the massive Chinese diaspora in Canada to advance the interests of the People's Republic of China. Let's not forget about the 2.5 years of the pandemic as well. So the psychological, physical, and economic damage which was imposed upon the country, that hasn't gone away. Canada had one of the strictest lockdown and vaccine programs in the world, culminating with the 2022 truckers' protest, which Trudeau shut down by debanking those participating in it. And Trudeau went so far as to invoke the Emergencies Act, something which is designed to be used only in wartime, which he used to crush these non-violent protests. And let's also not forget that 2021 was the year when mass immigration into Canada was kicked into hyperdrive, where the numbers, which were already high, rose exponentially. This was while Canadians were still being locked down. This is while they were still being forced to show these vaccine passports. While all of that was going on, the Canadian government was importing massive numbers, hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of people from places like India. The Canadian Armed Forces are an absolute embarrassment. The military has had an extremely difficult time attracting and retaining recruits for years now. They've responded by drastically lowering the physical requirements, greatly reducing the regulations for uniform, and even accepting non-citizen permanent residents into the military. There was a recent report which showed that over 2/3 of the armed forces are reportedly overweight or obese, so they're not even physically capable of soldiering. And the terrible physical condition of the military, it's a result of the decline in health overall in Canadian society, but it's also due to these pushes for so-called diversity. And when they say diversity, what they mean is they want anyone who is not a white man, and they will prioritize in recruitment and promotion anyone who's not white and male. And since their priority is not competence but ideology, well, they have to lower the standards. So for example, the physical aptitude test for the Canadian Armed Forces, it's easier than a high school gym class. And it's pretty clear why they have to do that. It's because A, they're having a hard time recruiting people, so they have to lower the standards and accept people who are not physically fit. And B, it's because they have these diversity targets, meaning that the physical requirements for this aptitude test, you can tell that it's designed to be something which a chubby woman in her 40s is able to do, because they have this goal of recruiting women. And on top of all of that, the Canadian military has essentially become this ideological indoctrination cult, constantly browbeating members with these anti-white and LGBT propaganda campaigns. Some of the leaks out of the Canadian Armed Forces have been quite shocking. For example, they're doing these courses about anti-racism and LGBT and whiteness in Canadian society and whiteness in the military. They're encouraging their staff to put their gender pronouns at the bottom of their emails. And they have these emails which they send out each day. It's always something like, oh, Asian Heritage Month, LGBT soldiers in the Canadian military, women in uniform, Black History Month, Indigenous reconciliation. And it just seems like it's just this constant barrage of just this trash. And if you're a self-respecting white man who actually decided to join the military, why on earth would you stay? It's clear that this institution hates you, so once you get the first chance, you're just going to leave. And that's why they have such a problem with retaining their new recruits. No one wants to be part of this. So what is the state of Canada after a decade of Trudeau? Canada's reputation as a prosperous, stable, and secure country has been shattered. It's now viewed both by many Canadians at home and outsiders around the world as a punishingly expensive, absurdly woke, dysfunctional basket case of a country. Now, I know that this problem predates Trudeau. It dates back to the 1960s. But from that period till the last couple of years, Canada still has been a materially comfortable and ultimately quite nice country to live in. It certainly was when I was a kid. But all the material comfort which Canada enjoyed during the 20th and early 21st century has just been poured down the drain in pursuit of this globalist, multicultural, post-national, sustainable development future. What are the actual results of the policy of multiculturalism? Well, non-whites have been given essentially carte blanche to shamelessly pursue their separate ethnic interests. The lower class ones, being like Africans or Afghans or Arabs or something like that, for them that entails basically pushing this alleged victimhood narrative and leeching off the country as a means of enriching their own group. And for the upper class ones, that being the high caste Indians or Chinese, well, what that entails is orienting Canadian politics in a way that it benefits their separate ethnic and national interests. So for these migrant groups, Canada's basically like a hotel you'd visit when you went on a business trip. You have no connection to it. You're just there to make money. And the country is now just rife with this foreign infiltration because of this open borders, multiculturalist doctrine. Among whites, the old are basically just living off of the residual prosperity of the past era. They bought their houses 30 years ago, they have their pensions, they saved up a bunch of money with their six-figure salaries, and they can still live comfortably, and they're holding on to this liberal identity of Canada from the 1960s to the 2010s. So with what's going on with Trump and the US today, they're basically trying to relive 2004 when Canada didn't follow George Bush into the war with Iraq. And they're still holding on to this smug, insufferable Canadian identity of defining ourselves as being more liberal than Americans because it allows them to continue to feel morally superior, and they're more or less isolated from the realities of the problems which this entire worldview has created. I know it's a cliche at this point, but it really is tough not to just feel utter contempt for the boomer generation. For younger white Canadians, we've lost all the material benefits of the country which we once had, and we're now faced with this ferociously hostile cultural landscape. Essentially, we're being told that our country, and us by extension, are irredeemably evil, and that the only way for us to be moral is to self-flagellate ourselves on the altar of anti-racism for non-whites, who will still blame us for all of their problems, and that we have to continue to do that until we just don't exist anymore. Unfortunately, some young Canadians actually embrace this suicidal, pathologically altruistic death cult and become these depressed, mentally unstable, nihilistic train wrecks of individuals. I've seen it myself with several of the people who I knew while growing up. Those who decide to reject this ideology are able to maintain a degree of self-respect, but they're rightfully embittered by the way the country has been turned against them to such an extent. Other than the delusional old boomers who are wealthy enough to avoid the realities of the country, there's this increasing sense that we're getting nothing out of the current consensus. Justin Trudeau became the most unpopular person in Canada. Following COVID, his unpopularity grew to such an extent that he wasn't even able to show his face in public without people yelling at him. At the end of last year, in an attempt to regain some standing in the polls, the Liberal Party was forced to eat crow and announced that they intended to reduce immigration. And they even admitted that the numbers in recent years have caused a disaster. Now, Trudeau and the Liberal Party, they tried to sugarcoat it. They said that, I think Trudeau's direct quote was that they didn't get the balance right. The numbers were just a little bit too high and they miscalculated, and that some bad actors exploited the situation, which, of course, that's a major cope. Anyone who's not bought into this suicidal globalist death cult knows that the immigration policy was just an utter catastrophe, and it was bound to be one. But they actually went ahead and admitted that they had made a mistake, which is actually more than I expected. Now, the numbers that they are proposing still constitute replacement migration, so that is not a solution. They're basically proposing return to 2018 numbers, which of course is not actually acceptable. And with the Liberal Party's approval rating hitting all-time lows at the end of last year and the beginning of this year, Trudeau a couple of months ago announced that he intended to resign and that the Liberal Party would soon have a new leader. So now let's talk about Donald Trump. As I stated in my previous video titled America's Thermidorian Reaction, I don't believe that the election of Donald Trump constitutes a counter-revolution against the 1960s Cultural Revolution in the United States. Fundamentally, Donald Trump and his entire administration are still post-war liberals. However, it does signify a shift away from the radical globalist progressivism of the 2010s and the early 2020s following the Great Awakening. So Canada is now faced with a situation where major countries are turning away from the globalist vision for the future which Canada went all in on. So when you think about something like the climate agenda, which Canada has bought into hook, line, and sinker, they're trying to implement these policies, these are globalist. It's an agenda which requires the entire world to do it, but then countries like the United States are now turning away from that. And to make matters worse, the United States is now imposing tariffs against Canadian manufactured goods and showing that they aren't committed to security agreements. And on top of all this, we now have Donald Trump and the MAGA movement saying that they want to annex Canada and make us the 51st US state. So I'll talk a bit about this prospect of Canadian annexation. I'm opposed to it. I'm opposed to Canada becoming a US state, and contrary to what all these idiot slop magatard accounts will tell you on X, it cannot benefit us. First and foremost, Canada is a unique nation which historically was constituted by two unique ethnicities, Anglo-Canadians and French-Canadians. We have our own culture, our own history, and our own way of life. While it may be similar to the United States, it's a unique one. I believe that Canada should be an independent country. I'm ethnically Anglo-Canadian and I want us to have our own country. Things like the monarchy, the history of the British Empire, the creed of peace, order, and good government, and Canada's unique ethnic and cultural foundations are what resonate with me. I have nothing against the US, but the creed of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the US Constitution, the American Revolutionary War, this doesn't resonate with me, because we're separate nations. Secondly, there is no benefit to this really at all. If we look at the demographics, the US is worse off demographically than Canada, has a higher crime rate, and is declining at a pretty equal pace. Joining the US would only further serve to dilute authentic Canadian identity, deracinate us from any coherent culture, and further enslave us to this globalist order. And our odds are a lot better going up against Ottawa than they are going up against Washington. Some say that we'll benefit from receiving the US Constitution, but the alleged benefits of the First and Second Amendment are not worth handing over our country to Washington. Hate speech laws exist in Canada, but there have only been a handful of people who have ever been prosecuted under them. So the threat of imprisonment for political speech is really not that high in Canada. It's not difficult to get a gun in Canada either. Millions of Canadians own guns. We don't need to hand our country over to Washington just so that we can get the US Constitution. The benefits do not outweigh the negatives of doing so. Furthermore, Donald Trump hasn't solved any of the problems facing the US yet, so there's no reason to assume he would solve ours. And there's no reason we can't solve our problems ourselves without becoming part of the US. We can stop immigration, root out foreign subversion, end LGBT propaganda, abolish affirmative action, abolish hate speech laws, and reduce gun control without becoming a US state. I also oppose the nihilistic fatalism of those who say it wouldn't make any difference because Canada's already finished or because Canada is already controlled by the US. First of all, Canada is not finished, nor is any other Western country finished. But if Canada were in fact finished, well then the United States is certainly no less finished, meaning the whole idea of annexation would just be a waste of time altogether. You would just be rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. I'm not saying that because I want to have one over at Americans. I hope they're able to save their country, but I don't think that their situation is really one that's enviable. I don't think it's any better than what we have in Canada right now. Secondly, this idea that the United States already controls Canada, so it would make no difference. Well, that's like saying that because Toronto and Vancouver are already majority non-white, then it wouldn't make a difference if the rest of the country became so as well. Canada has firmly been within the United States sphere of influence for at least the last 60 years, but it still maintains some degree of sovereignty. For example, Canada remains an ardent supporter of Ukraine while the United States has rescinded its support. Now, I don't necessarily agree with the Canadian government's position on Ukraine, but it's proof that the US doesn't control everything Canada does. And if US influence is bad, as I think it's been for the most part for the last 60 years or so, we should want as little of it as possible, not to become even more subservient to the United States. And for any Americans listening, I really don't think it's in your interests as well to have Canada become a US state. I mean, I think that the way forward for the United States long term would be for the more salvageable areas to break off from this behemoth of a state, which is just saddled with all these horrible crime-ridden cities full of libtards and non-whites. I think that you guys should want to separate from places like California, not incorporate more territory under Washington's control. I also think that long term, this is what Canada's going to need to do, just break off from places like Toronto and Vancouver, so you're just not saddled with all of that crap. I actually think that secession is the long-term solution in North America, not incorporating it into one mega state. Also, I don't think there's a very realistic chance of this happening, so let's not let it distract us from the real invasion via mass immigration. So, obviously, I'm opposed to Canada becoming a US state, and if you'd like a more detailed breakdown, my buddy Fortissax wrote a pretty long article about all of the arguments against Canada becoming a US state and how it really just wouldn't benefit us at all. Now, having said that, I want to look at some of the people who actually do support this. So some of them are these magatard, Trump-worshipping accounts of Canadians on X, and for them I have nothing but contempt. They're usually run by these boomers or Gen Xers, and they have basically rationalized themselves into impotence, where they've now taken on the role of this damsel in distress, fantasizing about their imaginary hero coming to save them and fix all their problems for them. Either that, or they put the cheap, shallow, surface-level populist aesthetic of MAGA above actual political results. And they're willing to trade Canada's actual authentic identity for this. So it doesn't matter how this is actually going to benefit Canada. Oh, he makes libtards angry, therefore, well, Trump is our guy and we have to give away our country to him. Now, there's another contingent who seem more sympathetic to this idea. A recent poll showed that about 43% of young Canadians are open to the idea of Canada becoming a part of the US. While I'm opposed to this, I fully understand why they support it. I don't know about with non-whites. I'm guessing with them, they might support it just because it means that their passport would be more valuable and they'd have more access to the United States and such. So, I mean, I guess that would be why they might support it, but I'm going to more focus on why many young white Canadians support this idea, or at least are willing to listen to it. For their entire lives, people like me included, we've been told that Canadian identity simply means being more libtarded than the United States. As a result, we've also got this image in Canada of the US being more conservative than it actually is. Perhaps it's more conservative than Canada on average, but it's certainly no bastion of conservatism. This is how the United States has been ingrained in the Canadian consciousness. Perhaps erroneously, but it's been like that for several decades. Canadians under the age of 40, including people like me, we've seen the wealth we knew growing up evaporate while also seeing the culture turn ferociously hostile to us. And if you're in your early 20s or late teens, that's all you've ever known. Wokeism for boomers in Canada allows them to simply feel morally superior to Americans while maintaining their wealth and isolating themselves from the actual results of this. But for the young, it has cost us everything. In Canada, where the young lean further to the right than the old, American conservatism is portrayed as the antithesis of Canadian libtardism. This is what leads many to erroneously see the prospect of annexation as a salvation from this misery. Furthermore, the prospect of American annexation seems a lot more preferable to the trajectory Canada is on, which would turn us into a vassal state of China managed by Indians. So while I oppose this idea, I see why some actually find it quite appealing, especially among the young. And unlike these maple magatards, as we can call them, Canadian Trump fanboys, I'm not going to laugh along as Trump insults Canada just because it makes Justin Trudeau angry, because it's an insult to the entire country. However, I can understand why someone like Trump feels brazen enough to say that he wants to annex our country and make it a US state. Canada's leaders have spent decades deliberately portraying themselves as weak and pathetic and pitiful as possible, as if this were some kind of virtue. And if you exude such weakness, you can't be surprised when people don't take you seriously anymore, because I don't take them seriously and neither does anyone around the world. The solution to all this is obvious. Canada needs to become a serious country again. We need to ditch libtardism, multiculturalism, and the post-national identity, expunge wokeism from all our institutions, track down on foreign interference, begin remigration, and reassert a coherent nationalism based on our authentic ethnic identity. Then and only then will we get Canadians to buy into our country again and receive respect from around the world. Unfortunately, this isn't going to happen under the current crop of elites. That's the long-term goal, but obviously it's not going to happen within the next year or so. So what can we expect in the short term? 2025 is an election year in Canada. Several months ago, the Liberal Party appeared dead in the water. Their polling numbers were at an all-time low and the Conservative Party appeared poised to claim a huge majority in Parliament. Three key events have changed everything. Firstly, the Liberal Party's pivot on immigration and Trudeau stepping down. It wasn't initially successful, but the Liberal Party promising to somewhat moderate their agenda in comparison to the ludicrous policies they've pursued since 2021 have allowed them to regain some of the support which they had lost. Trudeau had become the symbol of people's discontent, which they directed all their anger towards. With him stepping down, the Liberals were able to gain a little bit in the polls without such a despised leader leading them anymore. All of this would have been for naught if the Conservatives had just gone hard on immigration and promised to outdo the Liberals by greatly reducing the numbers incoming. But they've totally botched the issue, which would have given them an easy victory. To understand the Conservative Party of Canada, imagine a bird species who migrated to this paradise island, and then over the millennia, this bird species lost its ability to fly through evolution because all of its needs were provided for it, the species no longer needed to fly. Then when humans arrive, and they bring cats and other predators with them, well, they kill off this bird species because the bird species no longer can survive. It can't fly now that it needs it because it's lost that ability. That's basically what the Conservative Party of Canada is. Sam Francis referred to the conservative movement in the United States in the late 20th century as beautiful losers. Today we refer to this as cuckservatism. What this means is this weak, pathetic center-right position, which we've seen a lot in the past couple of decades, which they're constantly afraid of being called racist. They're constantly trying to pander to minorities and put them everywhere as proof that they're not racist, like the left accuses them of being. They constantly go on about values. They'll say that, well, nationhood isn't defined by ethnicity or ancestry, it's defined by values. Of course, the values which they claim to stand for, these are always vague and really don't inspire loyalty from anyone, but it's their way of squaring their right-leaning priors with the current consensus. And then they're always about economics, so everything is an economic issue for them. They try to break down the entire country into a spreadsheet and just go on about, well, this will be great for our GDP, because they can't actually take on any cultural, social issues because they've surrendered all those to the left out of cowardice. But then they always make sure to include Zionism into that. So they always make the exception for Israel. So this, which we refer to as cuckservatism, it was born out of sacrificing conviction for political expediency. But what's happened with the Conservative Party of Canada is that they've imbibed this center-right cuckoldry to such a degree that they're now incapable of being genuinely conservative, even though things have changed. Cuckservatism is not a winning strategy politically, electorally anymore. So even if they believed in nothing, they only cared about power, they only cared about getting elected, what they'd do is they would be actually conservative. They'd go to the right, they'd go hard on issues like immigration, but it feels like they've now become true believers in cuckservatism. It's incredible. So if Poilievre could actually read the room of the country, what he would have to do was go out and lambast the Liberals on immigration, promise a massive reduction, and then promise to send back those on expiring visas. Instead, what he did was, after the Liberals had promised themselves that they were going to claw back on student visas, Poilievre is in the parliament whining about how mean the Liberals and Justin Trudeau are being to Punjabi international students by capping the number of visas which they're going to be giving out. Or he goes on this speech where he says that, oh, you can be a Canadian even if your last name is Patel or Mohammed. So everyone is sick to the back teeth of this kind of rhetoric and sees that this conception of Canada simply isn't working. Yet Poilievre and the Conservatives seem enslaved to this 2010s center-right paradigm of desperately trying to prove how not racist you are at all costs. And when he finally actually addressed the immigration issue, albeit the numbers that he was proposing were lower than the Liberals, I think what the Liberals were promising was about 350,000 over the coming years. I think it was going to be around 400,000 this year and then about 350 a year or so later. The numbers were better. It was about 250,000. But that's still way too much. That's still mass immigration. That's still the great replacement. It's really just not good enough to galvanize support for the Conservatives. And now with Trump's tariffs against Canada and threats of annexation, along with the Conservatives fumbling the ball so badly, the Liberals are now recovering in the polls. It's partly because the right in general is just being lumped in with Donald Trump, but also that the Liberal Party is now seen as the party who's standing up to Trump. However, their swell in support is coming mainly from boomers and is fueled by a revival of the late 20th, early 21st century liberal national identity of Canada based on healthcare, hockey, and Tim Hortons. So in some ways, it's a black pill that this stupid, shallow, infantile national identity is making a comeback. But I guess it's somewhat of a white pill that it's only really making a comeback among people in their 50s and 60s. However, nonetheless, it does look like the election is up for grabs right now. I'll add here that while I don't think that the People's Party of Canada is perfect, there are a lot of problems with them. They are the best option, but unfortunately, it doesn't look like they're actually going to be relevant in this election. So, what can we realistically expect to see in Canada this year? Referring back to my previous video titled America's Thermidorian Reaction, I broke down the American establishment into 4 major agendas: the woke anti-white agenda, managerialism, the Zionist lobby, and big tech. I posited that Trumpism was basically a reaction on the part of the Zionist lobby and big tech against the excesses of woke managerialism, which, while they're not necessarily the same thing inherently, they're more or less unified. In Canada, the latter 2 agendas, the Zionist lobby and big tech, have a lot less power, and woke managerialism basically dominates the ruling class in Canada, as is the case in Europe. The Zionist lobby exists, but it mainly exerts itself through the Conservative Party, and it's a lot less relevant than it is in the US. But it is still there, and Canada doesn't have the cohort of tech billionaires which the US does. And I think Canada as a country and its decline can be seen as the best example of the failures of woke managerialism. So the elite in Canada, who went all in on this agenda in the past decade, are now facing the pressure of worsening conditions and growing discontent within Canada, the abandonment of the ambitions of woke managerialism around the world, such as companies abandoning the policies of DEI or countries repealing their sustainable development climate change policies, and the breakdown of the security guarantees which Canada has had over the past few decades. I won't make any predictions, but I will break down 3 possible scenarios we could see play out over the course of the next year or so in Canada. And I will order them from the most desirable to the least desirable. The first and most desirable realistic situation we could see play out in Canada would be what I will call the Laurentian Thermidorian reaction. This would entail the current crop of elites in Canada reeling in the excesses of woke managerialism which ran rampant in Canada during the Trudeau era. Much like I posited was the case with the Trump administration in the United States, and for the most part I think I'm happy with my previous video and what I stated. A few things I think I got incorrect. But in Canada, this wouldn't be a reversal of the 1960s Cultural Revolution, but it would bring an end to the most radical phase, which in Canada was the Trudeau era. This would probably include a reduction in immigration, not the moratorium and remigration that we need, but lower numbers. It would also include deportation of temporary residents with expiring visas, which in Canada there are almost 5 million of them, so just being able to get rid of them, that would be like a dream come true. It would probably also include a reduction of the over-the-top woke messaging from the government, which we've seen over the past decades, and cutbacks on the woke managerial bureaucracies. So you'd probably see a reduction in things like DEI policies, and maybe an elimination of things like the carbon tax or some of Canada's climate agenda policies. It might sound surprising to hear this, but I actually think this might be more likely to happen under Mark Carney. Carney is this bland, boring banker type. So obviously he's not our guy. And while he was involved with the radical Trudeau administration, I can't really see him as this true believer, so if anyone could make such a pivot, I think it would probably be him. The thing to understand about the Liberal Party is that, ironically, the Liberal Party of Canada is the least liberal party in Canada in the classical sense. They're a libtard party in that they believe in white guilt, mass immigration, multiculturalism, and such. But they do not believe in classical liberal values. They have a will to power and believe in their own legitimate right to impose their worldview. Their crackdown on the trucker protests in 2022 shows how unafraid the Liberal Party are to rule with an iron fist. They went so far as to enact the Emergencies Act, which is designed for times of war to put an end to a peaceful protest. Unfortunately, in the Trudeau era, the worldview which they imposed was extreme woke globo homo. However, if they decided that they needed to make a pivot, not out of a change of heart, but in realizing that they need to do so for their own self-preservation, I don't think that the Liberal Party would be afraid of backstabbing their radicals who have become a liability. At least I could imagine someone like Mark Carney doing that. He wouldn't do it in this loud and performative way like Elon Musk and Donald Trump are in the United States with their clawing back on the woke managerial bureaucracy, but I could imagine him kind of doing that in a more quiet way. Now, of course, this wouldn't be a solution to the problem long term, but the positive would be that of this outcome, this Laurentian Thermidorian reaction, this moderation of Canada's elite class, is that it would bring back a degree of sanity to the country and end the soft state of terror the country has been in for the past decade. It might satiate Trump while not giving away more than necessary. The reason I think that Carney might even be more likely to do this than the Conservatives is that the Conservative Party, as I mentioned earlier, are these weak classical liberals who seem to think there's a virtue in being the better man while they're walked all over. They don't really have a coherent vision, they're just against the Liberal Party. I don't think someone like Poilievre has the will to power to dismantle or even scale back the managerial bureaucracy, or follow through on the necessary crackdown on expiring visas for temporary residents, because he's basically giving away the election now by remaining true to these stupid, outdated center-right values. Now, this shouldn't be seen as an endorsement of Mark Carney, because this is assuming that this is the course of action which he is actually going to take, that he actually would moderate the country. It's more likely that Poilievre would take this course of action, but if Mark Carney did, all I'm saying is that I think he'd probably be a lot more ruthless in doing so. But there's another course of action which he could potentially take, which I'll get onto a bit later, which would be much worse. The second possible outcome of this year would be a US-backed right-leaning color revolution. This would entail Elon Musk or someone like that endorsing a candidate in Canada, most likely Pierre Poilievre, in the same way he endorsed the AFD in Germany and Reform in the UK. What you'd probably see is this person, most likely Poilievre, being massively promoted on X, the social media platform, and they'd probably form a strong relationship with Donald Trump, and they'd ape a lot of the US populist MAGA kind of rhetoric, but with a Canadian variety. I don't think that this person would outright call for Canada to be annexed by the United States, but they would bring Canada a lot closer to the US and bring it in alignment with American interests. Now, this is the second best possible outcome because it would also result in the end of the radicalism of the Trudeau era, and we get some of the benefits of the first option as well. But the downside is that it would make Canada more subservient to the United States than the first option, the Laurentian Thermidorian reaction, would. It wouldn't necessarily mean Canada would be annexed, but it would be a step in that direction towards more American control, which is something we need less of in Canada. In order for this to happen, though, the United States, probably someone like Elon Musk and maybe Donald Trump himself, they'd actually have to build some kind of relationship with Poilievre or some figure within the Canadian political establishment. I mean, I'll be honest, I don't really fully understand what's going on with this talk about annexing Canada, because it doesn't really seem very serious. It sounds more like the United States just wants to go off and do its own thing, which is why they imposed the tariffs on Canada, and basically they're just saying, well, yeah, if you want to join, then you must become a US state, which is obviously not an acceptable proposition. The other possibility could be that US intelligence knows something which the public doesn't, and that they realize that Chinese infiltration into Canada is actually much, much worse than it appears on the surface. I think that it's the former, but I've also thought about this second scenario as well. I've also considered that a possibility. I think the only way that the US would actually be able to bring Canada under its direct control would be through direct force, and I can't imagine that happening except for one potential scenario, which I'll get onto later. But it's one that doesn't seem very likely. It seems more likely that if they decide that they want to use Canada in some way, they'd try to garner favors from some members of the Canadian political establishment, people involved with the right, and try to kind of pull off this soft color revolution. Not really a revolution, but just getting their guy in office as they attempted to do in Germany and as they're attempting to do in Britain. The third and worst possible outcome I could imagine for this year would be Canada's elite doubling down on woke managerialism in the face of all of the internal and external pressure. I imagine that this would most likely happen under Chrystia Freeland, because she's basically just the female version of Justin Trudeau. But I also don't know about Mark Carney. I mean, maybe he could do the same, but he seems more like a pragmatist, so I imagine he'd be more open to the first option. So I think he's more likely to change the direction of the country, if for nothing else, out of necessity, whereas someone like Freeland seems a lot more like a true believer. It also looks like that within a few days of me uploading this video, the Liberals will have chosen their new leader. So I guess if that has already happened by the time you're watching this video, this can just be seen as a hypothetical. So what this third option would include, which is the worst one, would be a continuation of the policies of the past 4 years, that being the same levels of mass immigration, the green policies, the vicious anti-white rhetoric, the LGBT trash, and all of the misery which Canada has been through over the past decade. And this third option would result in Canada continuing its rapid decline economically and its demographic transformation at the same rate. The other problem with this option is it would continue to leave Canada wide open to infiltration from India and China. The long-term results of Canada not changing direction but doubling down would be that Canada would be facing the prospect of being controlled by the Chinese and managed by Indians. I know, it's horrifying to imagine such a place. And in this scenario, I could actually imagine the United States taking direct action against Canada. While I don't consider the Zionist and tech bro dominated Trump administration to be based in any real sense, nonetheless, a massive country on their northern border basically becoming a political vehicle of China would be a major threat to the United States, even to its Zionist and tech bro elite. If they saw this as the trajectory of Canada, I could imagine something like annexation becoming a real possibility within the next couple of decades. There would be even more people in Canada open to the prospect of annexation as a salvation from the expensive, dysfunctional, woke nightmare which the country is becoming. The other thing which I could see possibly happening would be either option A or B, that being the Canadian elite, the current ruling class, becoming more moderate, or the US trying to back some kind of color revolution in Canada. That could be attempted, but they fail to wrestle control back from the woke managerial bureaucracy, and then this basically just results in option C nonetheless. There's also talk in Canada now of a turn towards Europe and away from the US, which seems to be becoming more isolationist. This would take place under either option A or option C, and I think it could go one of two ways. If it were under option A, where the ruling class both in Canada and in Europe became more moderate, I think it would be a good thing. But under option C, where they just double down on the woke managerialist agenda, well, then it would be a disaster. Because the other problem with this third option, that being just a continuation of the status quo in Canada, is that in addition to Canada just remaining on the same trajectory of decline, I imagine that what would be incorporated into this would be a revival of the boomer liberal Canadian identity of being anti-American, and that would probably cause these people to take a hostile stance towards the United States, and then potentially even provoke military action against Canada. Under option 2, that being the US kind of backs a leader in Canada and they get into power and they kind of moderate the country a little but bring it in line with American interests, obviously Canada would remain wedded to the United States. The third option, that being doubling down and just continuing on the same path, that's the most worrying. However, there are some good signs that this won't happen. For example, when Trump was elected in 2016 for the first time, Canadian libtards were shrieking about how racist, homophobic, and Islamophobic Trump was, and how committed to LGBT rights and multiculturalism and diversity we are in Canada. This time, there's a lot less of that, and you see the same thing in Europe. So the woke managerial bureaucracy remains in power, but they seem a lot less enthusiastic about shoving diversity in our faces, suggesting that maybe begrudgingly they might be coming to the realization that they just need to get serious. Despite it all, I'm actually a lot more optimistic than I was a few years ago in 2021. The situation has got undoubtedly worse in Canada and around the Western world, but at least now there seems to be a realization that things need to change. And not only among the populace, but it does seem that some even within the system are now starting to realize this. The right-wing critique of the current consensus is being shown to be correct in many ways, and it has gained a great deal of momentum over the past couple of years. But regardless of what happens this year, my goal remains the same, and you can't say we aren't living in interesting times. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter or Telegram, and you can also subscribe to me on Substack, where I post exclusive content. If you'd like to make a donation, Substack is the place to do that. All links are down below. Thank you for listening. Till next time, Endeavor.